Hey everybody. So this lecture we're going to talk about right now is going to be over the reading by Hall in your Being Indigenous textbook. It's going to talk about the literacy and revitalization of endangered languages. Now, I know that those of you who are not really interested in pedagogy and or languages might get a little lost in this one. So I'm going to highlight the main points that I was trying to make. And the reason why it's thrown into the media and education group is A, because it's talking about pedagogy, and B, it's talking about language, which is so vital to education. And it's also something that, despite the fact that we're talking about endangered languages here, literacy itself is an obstacle for so many of those when it comes to education. And so, in talking about it in this particular chapter, we're going to talk about it in a way that the same way that particularly second language users or what have you can have an impact on education anytime English is your second language and you're an immigrant that comes into this country, or you're not an immigrant that comes into this country and English is your second language. But also, we're going to skip down and talk about the literacy part first before we start talking about the endangered languages. Illiteracy, talking about, and specifically they start it with who wants to read and who doesn't. And essentially, there's a really good line in here in the very beginning, and it talks about, let me see if I can find it. Okay, he talks about, there's a verse in the Bible that has the statement that says, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And it refers to the fact that people who read well read more, which leads to expert reading, where people who read less do not read well, which leads to novice reading. And I think that this is so incredibly important when we talk about any kind of education of anyone or any kind of pedagogical practice. So any of my teachers, hang in there a little bit, because if we're talking about the ways in which we promote who are good readers and who aren't, or who are struggling and who aren't, you create a difference that has a very lasting impact. And I say this because as someone who is dyslexic and was told so often that I was really bad at reading early in my education, and it took till fifth grade before I was actually diagnosed. But it created this gap between me and reading where there was a level of shame that was impacted in it. And illiteracy will do that. And whether you have the access to overcome it really depends on who your teachers are, how much work are invested, how much work your parents are invested in putting in or can put in, or their literacy. But also the resources that you have, including libraries or language patterns or etc. But if you already start with a struggle with one language, it's going to be next to impossible for you to then be invested in also wanting to learn or wanting to read a second language. And that's something that's really, really important as we talk about educational barriers in America, as we talk about educational barriers to specific subsets in America, including Indigenous persons, including Spanish speaking persons, including immigrants from refugee related areas that are not going to be English speakers, et cetera, because we're asking them to not only learn a second language, but on top of that, fill in that second language with a level of comprehension in order to meet certain criteria for a grade level that may not even be something that they would have reached in their own language in their own country. And that's something that we have to start communicating more effectively about and creating systems that advocate for. Also, reading and writing is a complex process. It requires a good portion of brain activity. It requires a good level of comprehension. It requires a specific kind of neuro processes. And so there are a large portion of people who, A, are not going to understand that complex, are not going to access that process, and or are going to have neurological difference or neurodivergency that would make that process incompatible with how they are made. And that's something that can happen on their first language, but especially on consecutive languages, because it makes it because we learn second languages very differently than we learn first languages. When we learn first languages, we're learning at generally a younger age. We're usually learning in a way to communicate. We're usually doing it in a very root way. Hey, we're pointing to something and someone's telling us something. Versus when we're learning second languages, that root memorization gets way harder because we're usually older, and usually it's being used in a conversational way, and that's usually how we learn second languages. um, I also want to talk about planting seeds for learners, real quick, because this topic is so much bigger than language, but is so important when we talk about language patterns. If we want to plant seeds in our as educators into our students, they have to have value. They have to see these as a positive thing in their life. They have to see that knowledge as something that will be useful, that will be worth the time and energy that it takes to learn that thing, and or that it's something they can do. And that's the biggest one. If you have, again, students who are struggling because of access barriers, or struggling because they've always been told they can't, then they're never going to be invested enough for those seeds to stick. And that's something that has to be on an educator to instill those seeds, right? And that's not to say that it's always going to work, because it's not just up to the educator. But, and this is something that, even no matter who you are, right? The more invested someone in, the more passionate someone is, the more you can understand that they are geeking out about something, the more likely it is for you to be invested in listening to what they're geeking out about. Whether or not you intend to learn anything or not, you're going to take something away, because you're going to remember what is invested in, and what has been invested in, as seeds given to you, right? And that's something that, as educators, we have to remember how we teach, the influence we teach with, the intentionality we teach with, and the seeds that we're going to plant. Okay. All right. Let's get to Indigenous languages. We're going to talk about kind of the issues that happen when trying to teach endangered languages, Indigenous languages, but the endangered of Indigenous languages, and why it is so hard to not only teach them, but find space to teach them, and what the process, what the pedagogical like hurdles are to teaching or revitalizing endangered languages. First, an endangered language, or an extinct language, is really a lack of people speaking it and then they become extinct after a lack of people speak it for an extended period of time. And that comes down to value. We have to put value, and the people who speak it have to put value in making sure that it stays, for it to stay. And if it does not have economic value or social value, or any kind of essentially, what's the word I'm looking for? If it does not have a reason for why to do it, why to continue doing it, and because there's so many obstacles in the way, then the more obstacles that are going to put in the way for no return creates issues with getting people to buy in, right? And that's kind of something that is happening with endangered languages. Speakers are very dispersed, right? So some of these languages are going to be speakers across really big regions that may not actually ever have contact with each other. And so if they do have events where they're going to speak this language, that's going to exist and have to be planned and have a significant amount of resources for those individuals to attend and be able to speak this language together in those spaces. And depending on these particular regions, some of those are so resource dense and so that's not the main priority, right? You got to meet your basic needs before you are putting in investment into time and energy into any kind of learned material of any kind. And so if those things aren't met, then you can't get to the place in which your brain is operating on a capacity to want to learn a language, if that makes sense. Um, most of these languages are spoke around non-speakers, so there's few opportunities to really speak it, fewer opportunities even to hear it, and it makes memorization the prime root of learning. And if you're not speaking it, if you're not using it, then that skill starts to slip, right? And it's something, especially with language, if we don't use them, then we kind of lose the ability to, especially write them, especially to um, read them if we're not doing that regularly. Again, these are economically dead languages, meaning that they're not used in any exchange for goods or services. They're not used in any space that could provide them any kind of economic propensity, right? So they're not going to be used in any job either that would get them or garnish them any kind of goods or services, etc. So that leaves them without that particular kind of value. They're inconsistent in their written versions. And what that means is that, and he talks about it a little bit, how in a lot of ways they're told to just spell the words how they think they might spell or how they want to spell them. Well, what that ends up happening when words don't have a particular way of spelling is that transcribing those words that are written down later and making sure that those meanings are translated correctly is damn near impossible. That you're going to get distorted meanings of those words or those even transcribed texts, that you're going to have very limited vocabulary because you're not going to have the ability to make a word plural or make a word in a different context, or there's not going to be the ability to essentially like compare those to maybe a first language, or maybe compare those to a language that might be better or might be known more in the area in order to teach, right? And you also leaves many translation software having issues making those in a way that you can even do those root memorization kind of word lists and things of that nature. Also, these are a lot of colonialized languages, and that means that there's some language abandonment in the sense that whether that's forced or by choice. So you have a lot of indigenous people who are now second generation English speakers because their parents or even their grandparents were sent to Indian schools and assimilated into the English language and Christian ideologies. And that has left a lot of the younger generations with mostly English or whatever the nation that they reside in, primary languages. So sometimes it's French or German or other things. But that's going to leave those languages as secondary due to the ways in which policy has and colonialization practices have taken away that as the primary language. And it's also going to be a need to target the brain in a similar way that English does. So, right, when we learn a second language, we usually learn it based on the first language. So, if the first or the primary language that those people are speaking at this point is English, then having words in an indigenous language that operate in a very different way, phonetically and grammatically, you're going to have a lot harder time processing that or learning that as a second language because you have to learn a different way of processing language. You also run into problems of where these languages could even be taught, what organizations would even use them, and man, I need to have somebody spell check for me again that you are noticing the lovely dyslexia firsthand in some of these slides. I apologize. But you're going to see this a lot in any language that has been forced out of a culture. by colonialistic processes. And that's just because without the space to operate those things due to um, a lack of support from the government that oversees these indigenous people and their practices, um, and the ways in which assimilation has had these cultural genocidal effects, is really going to make finding space and finding organizations willing to speak in those languages primarily really hard, especially when those organizations are geared towards resources for those indigenous people. If those indigenous people primarily speak English, then those resources have to also speak English because those are the things that they need. And they need to be able to reach the communities in which they operate in. And then they also have languages that appear like pseudo languages in the brain because they don't grammatically make sense to the primary language, or they don't phonetically make sense to how they were taught to sound it out or to express that. And so what you end up doing is having these languages where you have these like pseudo words or words that the brain doesn't process as a language. It processes them as like a fictional language. And see, I was trying to make a pseudo word just now. And so it's really, these are all processes, again, that make, as English has been made to be the primary language through those colonialistic processes, they have forced a different kind of language learning process that doesn't akin to some of these indigenous languages. And so that's causing a lot of issues, and it's causing, and they're still causing a lot of pedagogical practices in trying to revitalize some of these languages and how they would go about doing so. All right, so that's all I have for this one. We're going to do the brown enough chapters, and then we'll be done with this module. So I hope you're having a great week. I hope you're enjoying some of these readings. If you have any questions, because I know that one especially got really dense into the, some language formation. But if you do have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out and we can talk through them. All right.